Time nightmare new numbers for Joe Biden with an unexpected challenge from inside his own party. A recent Fox News poll shows nearly 30% of Democratic primary voters are abandoning Joe for his opponents, Robert Kennedy Jr. and Marianne Williamson. RFK Jr. is polling at a whopping 20%. Also, RFK Jr. made headlines with his comments about the CIA's alleged involvement in the assassination of his uncle. That would be former President John F. Kennedy. Take a look.
Do you believe they murdered or were involved in the murder of your uncle? What have you come to personally?
The CIA, yes, they were definitely involved in the murder and the 60-year cover-up. They're still not releasing the papers that legally they have to release. But I don't think there's any doubt if you look at this huge, monumental mountain of evidence and confessions, and so many people have confessed to their involvement.
Robert Kennedy Jr. joins us now. Great to have you back, sir. How are you?
How are you, Sean? Good to be back.
Okay, you said the evidence is overwhelming and beyond any reasonable doubt that the CIA was involved in the killing of your uncle, a U.S. president. What is the evidence?
Well, there's millions of pages of documents, of CIA documents, of transcripts, of recorded conversations from the Cuban embassy in Mexico City. It's hard to summarize the evidence. There are, as I said in that podcast, there are confessions of people who were directly involved in the plot, who were involved in the planning of the plot, who were peripheral to the plot. There's a 60-year cover-up. The Warren Commission was run by Alan Dulles, who was the head of the CIA, who my uncle fired, and then insinuated himself onto the Warren Commission and essentially ran the Warren Commission and kept this evidence from the Warren commissioners. By the way, when Congress, 10 years later, investigated the crime with much more evidence than the Warren Commission had at its disposal, Congress found that, yeah, it was a plot. It was a conspiracy. There were multiple people involved. And most of the people in that investigation believed that it was the CIA that was behind it because the evidence was so overwhelming to them.
The magic bullet never made any sense to me. I'll tell you that.
Yeah, well, none of it made any. I mean, Jack Ruby, even when I was a little boy, Sean, I was in the White House. My uncle was, laying at rest in the East Room, being waked. And I was standing in the main foyer of the White House with my Aunt Jackie Kennedy and my father and my mother. And President Johnson came in and told us that Lee Harvey Oswald had just been killed by Jack Ruby. And and I said to my mom at that point, I turned to her and I said, why did he kill him? Did he love our family? Well, that's a lingering question. What was Jack Ruby doing there? My father, when he investigated Jack Ruby, he found out that Jack Ruby had been deeply involved with Carlos Marcella's mob, with Sam Giancana, and all the people who were all of those mob leaders, Santos Traficante, who were the Havana casino owners, who had been recruited by the CIA in the Castro murder plot. So they were all working together in cahoots with the CIA. By the way, the day that my uncle was killed, I was picked up at Sidwell Friends School and brought home. The first phone call that my father made after J. Edgar Hoover told him that his brother had been shot was to the CIA desk officer in Langley, who was only a mile from our house.
Yeah.
And my father said to him, did your people do this? His next call was to Harry Ruiz, who was one of the Cuban Bay of Pigs leaders who had remained very, very close to our family and to my father. My father asked him the same question. Then my father called John McComb, who was the head of the CIA, and asked him to come to the house. McComb came over, and when I came home from Sidwell Friends School, My father was walking in the yard with John McComb, and my father was posing the same question to him. Was it our people who did this to my brother? So it was my father's first instinct that the agency had killed his brother.
We could spend a whole show on it. Let me go to your campaign. You are now polling at a very respectable 19% in one poll, 20% in another poll. And the polling against Joe Biden is horrible. 68% of people think he's too old, and 63% think he's not mentally fit. Do you agree with me that I do not believe Joe Biden is cognitively strong enough to be president?
I don't have enough information about that because I have not seen Joe Biden.
I'm not asking you to be a doctor, but when you look at him, does he seem like he's got it together? Come on, be honest. Does he seem like he has it together?
You know what? I have questions, but I will leave that to other people. I think that Joe Biden, the reason I'm running is because I don't like what Joe Biden is doing with this country. I don't like the war in Ukraine that we should have settled that war a long time ago. We're sending $113 billion over there. The entire budget of EPA is $12 billion. The budget of CDC is $12 billion. We have 57% of Americans who could not put their hand on $1,000 if they had an emergency. We have a quarter of Americans who are going to bed hungry. Food stamps last month, when we announced when we topped off these huge payments to the Ukraine, and at the same time $300 billion to the Silicon Valley Bank, we cut food stamps by 90% to 30 million Americans. We cut Medicaid to 15 million. So there's an imbalance in this country. There's this idea that we should be the policemen of the world. And by the way, what we're doing in Ukraine is not good for the Ukrainian people. We have killed 300,000 Ukrainian troops, 14,000 civilians.
Well, Europe hasn't stepped up.
Geopolitical machination to, in our own plot, to try to get rid of Putin and try to exhaust the Russian army. And we're sacrificing the Ukrainian people in that vanity.
I think you really only blame Putin. However, Europe has not stepped up, and I think they should. And Joe has put handcuffs on Zelensky, another issue I have, before we ever send another penny. There are a couple of issues where you and I would find agreement. Quote, we should have closed the borders. You said that. One position you've taken has resonated with conservatives, and that has to do with COVID vaccines. You take the issue a little bit further in terms of vaccinations in general. I'm not a scientist. I'm not going to debate you on the medical merits of it. But I know on COVID vaccines, they told the American people that if they got that vaccine, they would never get COVID and they would never transmit COVID. And that turned out to be false.
And Sean, they knew it was false at that time. At the time, they said it because in May of 2020, in fact, I posted on Instagram at that time, and they removed me. In May of 2020, they announced the monkey studies. They had given, the vaccines to the macaque monkeys, and then they had exposed them to COVID, and there was an equal amount of COVID in the nasal pharynxes of the vaccinated and the unvaccinated monkeys. So their own animal studies were showing that this vaccine had no possible barrier against transmission. And during the Pfizer studies and the Moderna studies, they never studied whether or not it was going to block transmission, because they already knew from the animal studies it would not. But they went ahead and told the American people something they knew was not true. If you get the vaccine, you won't get COVID. You will not spread COVID to other people. And that simply was
let me ask you this,
deceitful.
So I would say positions that you and I agree on, and I agree with you about the COVID vaccine in particular. I'm not sure if we agree on other ones, but so you support we should have closed the borders. You're very outspoken against the COVID vaccine, which had emergency authorization. You don't believe biological men should be playing in women's sports. Now, I have one last question. You might recall you were on an edition of Hannity and Combs, and you admitted,
let me add one
because
thing.
You're a big environmentalist, but you were getting on a private jet. Have you given up all use of private jets because of your environmental views?
Are you really going back to this, Sean? I've never objected to anybody
That's a simple question.
Jets.
Are you pledging to never, have you given up the use of private jets?
Sean, I don't fly on private jets. I don't regularly fly on private jets, and I'm not giving up any use if they're. Yeah, listen, I've never objected to people flying on private
listen,
jets.
I think this climate alarmist stuff is a bunch of crap, so I don't care if you do or not, but if you're claiming to be a big environmentalist, you shouldn't be flying on a private jet, right?
I'm not. No, I'm not that kind of environmentalist. I believe that. Listen, I have been fighting against pollution on the rivers and water, against coal and pollution, against carbon pollution because of the toxicity of those things. I have not told people that they shouldn't fly on private jets.
Okay. Well, listen, we'd love to have you back for a longer discussion. I think your 20% in the polls is very respectable. And I think Joe is more vulnerable than people think. And I think he should debate you out of fairness. But if he won't debate you, we'll give you airtime as often as you want, okay?
Thank you.
I appreciate you being